Hey friends, how are you? I'm Nicole, and this is Kinds with Cole. So, hello. How are you guys doing today? I hope you all are having an amazing day. I hope you guys have had a wonderful holidays and are ready for a new year. I hope you've got your goals set and are ready to achieve them and are ready for another crazy case. In today's case, we will be talking about the case of Jane Clough. She was a young girl who unfortunately fell victim to domestic violence. And no matter how hard everyone tried, no matter all the precautions that she had taken, that other people had taken to help her get out of this situation, she could not escape her attacker. This is one of those cases that is just heartbreaking because she did what she thought she should have done to keep herself safe, to escape her attacker's path, and yet she was unable to escape. So, let's get into today's case. Jane Clough was born to her mother and her father, Penny and John. They lived in Nelson, which is in Lancashire, which is just north of England. Jane was a beautiful, bright little girl. She was friends with everybody. She was always happy. She had this bubbly personality. And as she grew up, as she grew into this young adult, her parents couldn't help but be so proud of what their little girl had blossomed into, that she had turned into this young, amazing lady. She was extremely intelligent and such a hard worker. Jane's mom, Penny, was a nurse, and every morning growing up, Jane would watch her mom get up and get ready to go to work to help these people that were sick or that had an injury that needed somebody to help and even potentially save some lives. Jane ended up following in the footsteps of her mother, and she became a nurse herself. And it was the perfect job for her. I mean, it suited her loving, caring, nurturing personality that she already had. And for those who are the patients at the hospital, it's nice to have a nurse come in that has, this uplifting, bubbly personality that genuinely wants to be at work, that genuinely wants to help people. I used to work in a hospital, and for some people, to be a patient there, it can put you in a depressive state of mind. I mean, I know some of it's temporary, but some of it isn't. It's an ongoing problem for these people, and it can be very depressive. So, this was just the perfect path that Jane ended up on, because she had the personality that could just swoop in and help these people of all sorts. Now, after being there at the hospital for a few months, Jane had met a man by the name of Jonathan Vass. Jonathan was a few years older than Jane. He was 27 and he worked as an EMT. He was originally from the south of England, but when he was a young child, he and his family had moved up to Lancashire. The two had met at work, and Jane just instantly had this feeling about Jonathan. Every time the two would pass one another or, run into each other at work, she'd always, give him this little smile or, say hi, make sure to make eye contact. And he soon started to make it a point to make eye contact back and give a smile back and try to start up conversations with her. And eventually, he made it very obvious to come up to Jane and make sure to tell her hi and ask her how her day was every time he was at the hospital. As Jane got to know Jonathan more and more, she started to really like him. She thought, he was just nice and funny, kind. He was sweet. He just seemed to mesmerize Jane. She felt they were perfect for each other. I mean, they were both taking coffee breaks together at work or, running up the street for lunch. They started going on dates here and there. And he would just, pop up and surprise her every now and then just to, make her day. Just to say hi, just to give her a hug, just to see her for a few minutes. Now, Jonathan outside of work was very into going to the gym. He would go out to have a few drinks with his buddies. He was into sports. He was that type of guy. He was just very into weightlifting and bodybuilding. In fact, he had a part-time job as a bouncer. So he was actually rather physically in shape for the most part. And Jane loved that about him. She loved how he had all these hobbies and interests, that he was actively going after what he wanted in life. She felt he was just the entire package. He had this strong macho man persona, but he also had this, this kind and soft and gentle hearted type of guy persona too. He was a perfect combination of both in Jane's eyes. The two kept their relationship a secret for a couple months. Jane didn't really want to rush to tell her friends at work, but eventually the cat came out of the bag when she told them the exciting news of who this mystery man was that she had been seeing for the last couple months. They didn't give her the reaction she was expecting them to give. They were very much so in disbelief that Jane would be with someone like Jonathan, because they didn't see Jonathan was this tender-hearted, loving, kind, amazing man that Jane saw him as. They saw him as a rude, inappropriate, unprofessional, just very weird and awkward type of guy. Not someone who they would particularly care to see, but Jane couldn't understand why they weren't just happy for her after seeing how happy this man has made her for the last 4 months. But she didn't let that affect anything. She just thought maybe she knew him in a different way than they did. Maybe he was showing her the side of him that he had never shown anyone else. And she continued on with the relationship with Jonathan. As her friends and family watched Jane fall for this man deeper and deeper, they couldn't help but notice just how happy she actually was with him. He may not have checked off everything on their list, but he surely seemed to check every box off on Jane's list. And finally, the day came and Jonathan asked Jane to officially be his girlfriend. Now, at this time, Jonathan also thought he should let Jane know that he had actually been married and had a wife with 2 kids, but that he had caught his wife cheating and was divorcing her. He told Jane that he wasn't officially divorced yet, but separated. Divorce was just not as easy because they had kids together, which is a believable statement. It does take a little bit longer when you have children, but he reassured Jane that they were for sure getting a divorce. You can only imagine the feeling Jane got. I mean, imagine someone who you find yourself falling for months. I mean, you see yourself marrying this person and having kids and having this life with this person, to find out months later that they are in fact married with 2 kids. She was heartbroken. She was devastated. Why did it take him so long to tell her that? But after talking with Jonathan and him explaining how they are separated and plan on proceeding with a divorce, Jane decided she felt comfortable staying with Jonathan, and so she did. She actually felt sorry for Jonathan to have to be stuck with a cheating wife and have 2 small children with her. What misery, she thought. 10 months into the relationship, Jane and Jonathan decided to take their relationship to the next step. Jane had introduced Jonathan to her parents. They adored him. They thought he was great. And Jonathan told Jane that his divorce was finalized. So the two thought, what better timing than now to move in together? Jane was beside herself. She was so happy. Everything was just playing out perfect, or so she had thought. After moving in with Jonathan, Jane never really realized that he had been lying this entire time about getting a divorce. There was no divorce. His wife had never cheated. He had no intentions on leaving his wife and children. He would actually make up lies to tell Jane about how he had, to pick up a night shift at work, or he had to run some errands and, wouldn't be back for a while so he could actually go back home to his wife and children. And I would imagine he probably told his wife the same thing so that he could come back and see Jane. So he's living this double life between these two women, which I could only imagine was exhausting for him, having to keep up with all of those lies. And Jane was completely oblivious to these lies. Jonathan would tell her it was actually her parents that started to notice the random, pointless lies that Jonathan would tell people. Like, he would say how his grandmother was this millionaire and was going to leave this house to him when, she had passed. And yet he had thousands of dollars worth of debt, and it just didn't make sense. It didn't make sense why his millionaire grandmother would let him struggle financially when he was due to get her house in however many years. Like, none of it would make sense or added up because it was all lies. And like many people in Jonathan's life, Jane's parents made up excuses, saying that, maybe he just wanted to impress us. Maybe that's why he would tell, like, literally random, pointless lies to add to the conversation, to impress us. He really wanted us to like him. So maybe that's why he would just tell us the most out of the blue, off the wall things that just didn't make sense. But he was doing this to everyone he ran into. I mean, men down at the local pub he was having a drink with. He was a pathological liar. And this wasn't the only red flag that drew attention to Jane's parents or just people who were around Jane. They noticed just how controlling Jonathan was becoming of Jane. He would call her all hours of the day and night to check up on her and want to know, where she was, what she was doing. And while Jane saw this as being a genuinely nice gesture of Jonathan, which it can be, but the amount that he was checking in on her was excessive. And of course, Jane doesn't see it that way. The others do because love is blind. I mean, she thinks Jonathan is her Prince Charming at this point and is perfect and everything she could ever want in a future husband and father. Jonathan now taking his control issue to a whole new level, and while he's still constantly checking in on Jane, he was now starting to break down her self-esteem. And it started first with comments to her like, no, you don't look good in that, or you're kind of stupid for thinking that, or how coworkers at work didn't really like her and they thought she was just a lazy nurse but would lie to her about it. Just things like that really get someone to start questioning themselves and ultimately thinking this person is telling them the truth, and that they're the only one that they can trust. From there, he would then start making these comments to Jane or about Jane while the both of them were out, in public with their friends or around Jane's parents, just around people. purposely trying to humiliate Jane. He would go into work and tell her coworkers how, she would start screaming at him and just really trying to spread lies about Jane, making her out to be this person she truly wasn't. He was trying to turn her friends at work against her so that she was isolated and felt alone, except for having him. I mean, he even went as far as to go to her parents' house while she wasn't around and started telling her parents things that you just don't tell your parents. There's just some personal, intimate things I would assume that Jane wasn't wanting to share. I mean, she trusted this man and would share things with him, and then he'd turn around and just spread the news all over town. Jonathan now took it up another level with his control issues and felt that the phone calls and text and his techniques to isolate Jane were not enough. He needed to physically see where and what Jane was doing. So he started to physically stalk Jane. He would get in his car and follow her if she went to run errands or if she went to work. He would drive by to check to see, she was still there during her shift, or to see, she went to the supermarket. It's been 20 minutes. Is she still at the supermarket? There was one time where Jane had told Jonathan that she was going to go out to lunch with her friends, and he didn't believe her. So he followed her to see for himself, and as he was pulling down the street, she saw him. She saw his car and him inside the car, checking in on her. Now, I don't know if anyone else knew that he was going to these measures, but Jane surely knew. She saw it with her own eyes. And there were a lot of things Jane wasn't quick to tell people about with her relationship specifically, like how when Jonathan had moved in, something snapped in him and he just started to physically abuse her at that point. And at first they would get into an argument. He would get in her face, maybe smack her or shove her into the wall. And she didn't like that side of Jonathan that was coming out, but she would do like most victims do in that situation and make up an excuse and blame themselves. Oh, I shouldn't have made him so mad, or, oh, I'm sure he feels bad and he won't do it again. But in fact, the next time it was worse. And then the time after that was even more worse, and so on and so on. I mean, this poor girl was wearing scarves and scrub jackets and long sleeves under her shirts to try to hide the bruises for months, until one of her coworkers noticed a bruise on her neck. And at this point, Jane told them everything. She told them how nasty Jonathan had been to her since he had moved in, how she felt so controlled and not appreciated. And she showed them the bruises that went from behind her ears to the back of her neck and down her back some. Her hair was able to cover it for the most part, but, she had shown them and they were just horrified that this was Jane's home life. This amazing, bright, bubbly, loving, caring person was going home to this monster every night. But they weren't surprised because they always knew Jonathan was just a little bit different and not in a good way. But it's hard when you see someone like Jane having the life sucked out of her by someone like Jonathan. If you've ever been in that position, it is truly devastating because you can clearly see as day what the problem is. But by that point, that person is so mentally beat down, they don't see their own worth anymore or how to even get it back at that point. And you can tell them time and time again to leave that situation. But I think it becomes difficult because when you're in a toxic relationship like Jane and Jonathan's, you hold on to the person you thought you knew. You don't want to admit their flaws, and you certainly don't want to admit that you are blind to all the red flags, especially when people are telling you, hey, You need to get out of that relationship. And I think that's where Jane was at this point. That, yeah, he had messed up and he physically hurt me, but I know it was a mistake and that's not who he truly is. He isn't truly that type of man. I think it was one of those situations. In January 2009, Jane ended up getting pregnant and she was so happy. She always wanted children. I mean, she had a great job, her own place, a relationship that was rocky, but she was extremely hopeful for, and now a baby on the way. She was very anxious about having this baby around Jonathan and his anger outburst he would have, but that feeling would be drowned out by the feeling of hope that she had. She had hoped that this baby would be the answer to stopping all of Jonathan's erratic behaviors. She thought maybe something would click and he would realize, oh goodness, Jane's pregnant with our baby. I need this to work. I need to make this work. I need to stop being abusive and not be such a Richard. It was just a lot of wishful thinking on Jane's behalf, I think, but I can't blame her. She wanted a family and a life with this man who she thought he was, and she is unfortunately finding out who he really is. Jane's parents found out about their first grandbaby, and while they should have been filled with joy and excitement, they weren't. They were quite terrified for Jane. I mean, everyone felt Jane needed to get out of this relationship, and now they're having a baby together, making it 10 times harder to get away from this manipulative man. But they told Jane they loved her and would always be there for her and her baby no matter what. If she ever needed a place to come and stay and feel safe, they would gladly take her anytime, any day, and with no hesitation. When Jane was 7 months pregnant, Jonathan had wanted to engage in some relations one night, and Jane didn't feel like it. She's 7 months pregnant, and if you've ever been 7 months pregnant, sometimes you're not always in the mood, and she had told him no that night. Jonathan had taken it upon himself to force himself on Jane that night. I think Jane's feelings of being heartbroken, shocked, devastated, betrayed, all of those feelings had reached an all-new high. I mean, can you imagine you are 7 months pregnant with this man's baby who you are so hopeful to have a life with and that he will change his ways, and he goes and can't even give you enough respect when you tell him no. And he continued this. He continued this behavior until the baby was born. Jane gave birth to a baby girl in October of 2009. And when Jane came home with the baby, it was like something had changed. Something in Jonathan had changed, because for a short while, all the abuse had stopped and Jane really felt like she was going to get her happy ending. But 6 weeks after being home, Jonathan had once again forced himself onto Jane in their bedroom while their baby girl laid in her crib next to the bed. And this triggered something because Jane realized that she can't go on like this. She had a baby to protect, and she wasn't going to let her daughter grow up seeing this type of behavior, thinking that it is acceptable. One day while Jonathan was at work, Jane had gone around the house collecting all of her stuff and all of the baby stuff and packed it all up and headed to her parents' house. Of course, they took her and their grandbaby in with open arms, and at this point is when Jane had confessed to her parents just how bad the relationship had gotten, how nasty Jonathan had become since they moved in together, how he would take her phone from her like she was a child and not allow her to speak to anyone, or how he would lock her in the apartment for hours at a time so he could go do as he pleased, and all of the physical abuse that had been happening. But she did not mention the sexual abuse to them. And I'm not sure why. It's probably because it was just an extremely difficult topic to talk about. And I think for anybody who has ever been in that situation, it takes time to open up about that. As her parents learned all the new details about Jane and Jonathan's relationship that they hadn't known before, they once again encouraged her to leave him once and for all. And as much as they encouraged her to, they knew they couldn't force her to leave him. They couldn't force her to not interact at work with this man, or even for the baby's sake, as, the baby had gotten older. Jane continued to stay at her parents' house with her baby, and a couple of days later, just as everything was calming down, Jonathan sends a text out of the blue, and it says, "We are staying together regardless of our problems." Like, that was his attempt to reach out to her after she had left him. And Jane responded with, "I love you, Johnny, but I don't feel safe with you anymore." And in response to that, Jonathan said, "I love you too, but why run to your parents? I'm not going to kill you or batter you." And for days, this continued. He would say sorry and beg her to come home, and she agreed, but only under the circumstances that he would get professional mental help. To no surprise, Jonathan said he had already started this process 3 days prior and was going to seek the help that he needed. Jane packed up all of her and the baby's stuff and went back to Jonathan and really thought that things could be different if he gets the help that he truly needed. Within 3 days, Jonathan had forced himself on Jane again, and she knew things were never going to change. He was never going to change. She packed up her and the baby's belongings once again and went to her parents. And this time, her parents told her she needed to go to the police. And Jane agreed. She did. She didn't see Jonathan as this amazing Prince Charming anymore. She saw him as this monster that abuses her. Jane had gone down to the police station and reported all of the abuse that took place for the duration of their relationship. They got statements from her family and friends, along with taking pictures of all of her current bruises. They immediately had gone and arrested Jonathan. They brought him in for questioning, and of course, he denies everything, saying Jane is a liar and just wants attention, but police weren't buying into his story. All the statements from Jane's friends and family seemed to have matched her version of things, and so did her bruises on her body. Since he made the claim that she fabricated this story, they called Jane in for weeks and weeks for her to tell her story over and over again. And every time she told it, it all added up. None of it changed. All the details were the same, so she must be telling the truth. In November 2009, Jonathan was charged with tape with an R and assault and arrested. And at this time, Jane and her family and friends all felt relieved. They felt like since Jonathan was locked up, that she could feel a sense of freedom for the first time in a very long time and start to not be so anxious and scared every time her phone rang or every time she went to the local coffee shop. At this time, Jane had decided she wanted to go back to work part-time. She had currently been on, maternity leave, and she was ready to get what her life used to be back. So while she was working a few nights a week, her parents would, keep the baby, and it turned out to be a nice schedule for everyone. Meanwhile, Jonathan had applied for bail twice while he was waiting for his trial to begin. He was allowed to apply a maximum of 3 times before he just had to wait it out until his trial had began. Both times he had applied, he was denied. But that didn't stop Jane and her family from feeling anxious and worried. But, their family lawyer reassured them, he's already applied twice. He had been denied twice. He will apply a 3rd time, but I'm most certain he'll get denied. However, after 2 months, Jonathan was released on bail to await his trial. Now remember, he had been locked up for 2 months, and his wife, who he was making up these night shifts to and lying about running errands so he could go see Jane, has not seen him for 2 months. So she is now thinking to herself, like, what in the world happened to my husband? Where is he at? This isn't necessarily something you can hide from your significant other. And if you can, you must be one hell of a good liar. So needless to say, his wife found out about everything. She found out about Jane, about the baby, how her husband had been having an affair and living this double life and has now been arrested and charged with tape with an R and assault. And she had no idea that Jane even existed. No idea at all. And come to find out, Jonathan was not the nicest husband to her either. I'm not sure if he was as nasty to his wife as he was to Jane, but he was nasty to her, and she kicked him out. But she did allow him to see their 2 children still. Now, after Jonathan was released, Jane and her family were extremely concerned because they knew some way, somehow, Jonathan would find his way to Jane. Now, he obviously had some restrictions because of his charges. I mean, he was fired from his job, so he shouldn't be at the hospital unless he is a patient. But even so, he wouldn't be allowed around Jane, and he wasn't allowed around her baby. The family still took every precaution they could. They changed all the locks on the doors, even added locks to the doors. Jane was escorted everywhere, literally everywhere. If she went to work, a coworker would come out to her car when she parked, walk her inside work, and then when the shift had ended, they would walk back out to Jane's car, watch her get in the car, and drive away. If she went to the store, someone was always with her. I mean, she had no moments alone, which was very clever and smart on Jane's family's behalf. Jane herself started keeping a diary and documenting how she was so fearful that Jonathan was going to come get revenge on her. She'd write how she had to live in a constant state of hell, and when is this going to end? She says she didn't even think they were going to make it to trial without Jonathan trying to do something. She just really felt in fear for her life at this point, and that has got to be an awful feeling to have. And these diary entries went on for like 6 months. And the trial wasn't set up until October 2010. So she had a long time to go before the trial even began. In May of that year, she had went to the police station to write up the official police report that would be used against Jonathan in court. So she had to write down all of the details that she had already told the police. And overall, Jonathan was facing 9 counts of tape with an R and endless counts of domestic violence due to the physical abuse. And since Jane was the only direct victim, it was going to have to be her that stood up on the stand and testified against Jonathan once the trial started. She was going to have to sit there and tell a courtroom filled with strangers intimate details about her life, some of which she may have never wanted anybody to know. And then she will have to tell those same strangers these horrendous acts of violence towards her, all while Jonathan is sitting right there. I imagine it isn't easy because remember, this guy was her Prince Charming. To just have to sit there and really accept the reality you are in, it would be tough. But Jane was willing to do it if it meant that her and her daughter would ultimately be safe at the end of it all. Now, after the official report was processed and set in record, the police decided to let Jonathan's attorney know. So naturally, Jonathan's attorney let him know that Jane would be testifying against him come October. This infuriated Jonathan because to him, Jane is ruining his life. She is the reason he's facing prison time and facing these abuse charges. She is the reason he lost his job. She is the reason his wife kicked him out. Jane is the reason Jonathan's life had come spiraling down. Never once did Jonathan sit back and think to himself, I took this action and this is the consequence. He put all of the blame on Jane. And he decided that he was going to stop her from testifying. So he started to stalk her online, checking out her social media, seeing what she's up to, getting, just the most up-to-date information on her, which was against his bond agreement. He was released on a bond and the agreement that he had no contact with Jane. This included online. Once he figured out her schedule, where she was, what times and days, he started to physically drive to those places and started stalking her in person. At this time, though, Jonathan had moved back in with his parents, who lived 50 miles from where Jane was. So every day, Jonathan got up and drove the 50 miles to spy on Jane for however long. Every day he did this. And then he would drive the 50 miles back home to his parents' house. And Jane, she was just completely unaware that he was following her every day for most of the day. In fact, she was so unaware of it, she actually started feeling more confident when she went out and felt that she didn't need an escort every time she went somewhere. She felt maybe if she could just let people know, hey, I'm going here, I should be there at this time, I'll be there for that long, and then I'll be back, home, that at least, they would know. But she felt safe enough to get to places on her own. In July 2010, Jane decided she was going to go out with some friends for the first time in a long time, since before she had gotten with Jonathan. And they all had gotten together and they went to a bar, had a few drinks, and a really good time. They ended up all sleeping over at the one friend's house, and then next morning, they went to grab some breakfast. After breakfast, the one friend had dropped Jane back off at home, and they just all felt so hopeful and happy that the old Jane was coming back, that their friend was going to finally find some peace at the end of this tragic era in her life. On the night of July 25th, 2010, Jane had gotten ready to go to work for her night shift at the hospital. She arrived at work around 8 p.m., had parked her car in the staff parking lot like she usually did, and got out to head to the front entrance of the hospital. Little did she know that Jonathan had parked his car a little bit down the way, so he wasn't near the hospital, but he had rode his bike down to the staff parking lot, waiting for Jane for over an hour before her shift had started. When he had spotted Jane, he waited for her to get out of her car, and when she did, he jumped out from a hiding spot and demanded that Jane drop all of these charges. Drop the charges, don't testify against him, and just move on with her life. And could you imagine how petrifying that would be, knowing what he's already capable of? But she told him no. She wasn't dropping the charges, and Jane just had a gut feeling that Jonathan didn't just come to tell her to drop the charges. And she was right, because before she was able to get away from him, Jonathan had grabbed Jane, pulled a knife out of his pocket, and started stabbing her in the torso over and over and over again. He just kept stabbing and stabbing. Even after she had fallen to the ground, he continued on until he was finished. And once Jonathan was finished, he just stood up, walked over to his bike that he had rode, from his car to the hospital parking lot. But before he headed off, he had turned back around to look at Jane one more time. But Jane wasn't there. He didn't realize that Jane was still alive. He never thought she'd be able to survive with how many times he had stabbed her. She somehow found the strength and energy to pull herself up and try to get into her car. Jonathan ran back over to Jane and slit her throat so that she would essentially bleed out. He knew he could not let Jane survive this attack. A few minutes after Jonathan had got back on his bike and rode off to his car, Jane was found, and because she just so happened to work in the emergency department, they were able to wheel her in there and instantly start performing on her to help save her life. But she was unrecognizable. Her face was so swollen. She had been stabbed so many times. There was just so much blood. The only way they even knew it was Jane was because of her badge, like her ID badge that they all have to have at the hospital. And Jane was sadly pronounced dead shortly after the staff, including her own friends, tried all they could to save her life. The blood loss was just too severe. After the autopsy was performed, Jane was stabbed over 50 times, 19 of those being in her neck. Her deepest wound she has sustained was 13.5 centimeters, and then around 20-something defense wounds. So after all of this had happened, the entire hospital was put on lockdown because one of their staff had just been murdered in the parking lot, and they didn't know the extent to this crime. Was it just Jane being targeted, or was it a group of people coming after the hospital in general? So they had to take all the precautions that they could. 4 hours after Jane had been attacked, her parents were alerted, and they knew. They knew it was Jonathan. All of her friends at the hospital already had known it was Jonathan when they saw it and they figured out it was Jane. And they all told the police to go get him. So the police had put 24-hour security watch on Jane's parents and her daughter, because who's to say Jonathan doesn't go after the baby now too? They also put out alerts and had many officers looking for Jonathan. And for hours, Jonathan was just driving around. I don't really think he had a plan, but at some point, after hours of driving, Jonathan got this bright idea to go to Jane's parents' house. So he turned the car around and headed there. When he arrived in the early hours of the morning, he got out of his car and went around to the trunk to get something out, completely just oblivious to the fact that there are officers physically guarding the house. 2 female officers walk up to Jonathan because they notice him pull up, get out to go to his trunk, and when they figured out it was him, they arrested him. And of course, while he was being arrested, he just was being sexist to the female officers. Once they had him handcuffed, they looked into the trunk of his car and they noticed cans of gasoline. I mean, what was he going to use that for? I don't know. Maybe to blow himself up in the car, or maybe to set the house on fire. Who really knows? When the police took him back to the station to start questioning him, he had no remorse, no guilt, no sadness, nothing. He just sat there in his chair, leaned back with his arms crossed. The trial began on October 7th, 2010, and because Jane could no longer be there to testify, her diary was able to be used. All of her entries saying how she felt unsafe, she was scared, she knew he would come back to get his revenge on her. Jonathan was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years for the murder of Jane, but shockingly, her tape with an R charges were dropped. I don't know why, but they were. Maybe because they didn't have concrete evidence and her family's attorney felt it was best to just stick with the concrete charges. I'm not really sure. But that means if Jonathan were to be released in 30 years, let's say, he would be 60 years old and not have to be registered as a ex-offender. Which is kind of a scary thought after he had repeatedly forced himself on his own girlfriend, on his own pregnant girlfriend. So that is all I have for today. This is just such a sad case when this girl was doing everything she could to get her and her daughter a safer life. Had that judge had not granted him bail, things probably would had turned out differently. There would have been a different outcome. But you guys will have to let me know what you guys think. And until next time, please remember to be safe, and I will see you then. Bye.